Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 122. Today's guest is Kary Wayson. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, I'm talking with poet Kary Wayson, a longtime resident of Seattle, Washington. Kary Wayson works as a poetry teacher and freelance editor, as well as an associate editor for Poetry Northwest. Kary has won many awards for her work, including the 92nd Street Y's Discovery the Nation Prize, the Crazy Horse Linda Hull Memorial Prize, the Charles B. Wheeler Prize for her first book, American Husband, and the Burnside Review Prize for her second book, The Slip. She has received fellowships and grants from Artist Trust, the Allied Arts Foundation, the Washington State Arts Commission, and For Culture. Her poems have appeared widely online and in journals and anthologies, including the Best American Poetry Series and the Pushcart Prize anthology. So, I was introduced to Kary's work by the poet Gabrielle Bates, one of the hosts of the excellent podcast, The Poet Salon, which, by the way, if you're not already subscribed to The Poet Salon, I highly recommend it. Anyway, Gabby suggested The Slip as something I might enjoy, and I'm so glad she did because these poems are great, and they really reward repeated reading and deep engagement. The poems and the language in them are, as the title suggests, slippery. They aren't particularly easy to get your arms around, at least not with a quick reading. Instead, these poems ask the reader to slow down and pay attention, which is really my favorite kind of art. But the way the experience unfolds as you read and reread these poems, the way that there's both a longing for past longing, but also humor. It makes you want to spend time with them, which is to say that I'm happy that I got the chance to talk with Kary about her book. I've included some links in the show notes to where you can purchase your own copy of The Slip, and as always, I encourage you to order from your own local independent bookstore. Also, for subscribers to the KTCO Patreon, Kary has generously added a reading to the show's bonus archive, her poem Untitled Poem for a Feeling, which was recently published in The Volta. I've opened up the show's bonus archive to the public during the pandemic, so this is a great time to check out all the bonus content. You can find that at patreon.com/likewisemedia. I've currently paused payments on the Patreon campaign, but if you're enjoying the show and would like to support it, you can make a pledge now. And when I restart the campaign later in the year, you'll be ready to go. Once again, that's patreon.com/likewisemedia, and there's a link in the show notes for that. Finally, a quick programming note before we get started. Our next episode will be a KTCO book club conversation with Gabrielle Bates, in which we'll be discussing Bridget Pegeen Kelly's 1994 poetry collection, Song. That will be released on March 10th, and if you'd like to read along, there's a link in the show notes to purchase a copy of the book. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Kary Wayson. I wanted to say I really enjoyed your book. I really enjoyed it even more on the second reading, and I was wondering if we could start off with a reading?
Of course.
Okay.
My first thought is to read the title poem,
Sure.
The Slip, which actually comes almost at the very end of the book. Okay, The Slip. Think of it like this. A poem is a room into which we enter. Each object is deliberately placed. We put the wooden bird on the top shelf, a jade plant on the windowsill, a huge lamp in the corner. Then happily, that's enough. We brush our hands and turn away. Next day, we go into the room again. The bird looks down at us from the shelf. The lamp is ridiculous in the corner. But inside the open window, there hangs from a hook the thin white slip we mended with scissors. It turns a bit, this way and that. The delicate straps are a little yellow. We can think of it here as an emblem of a friend, someone who's quiet, keeps us company. Now from the valley comes the howling of a dog. Otherwise, only the knitting click of the slip on its hanger. She's better than us, slender and blameless. She moves in the waves, hair makes around a face in a dream of the sea. Look, Right here she hangs in full sight of heaven. And the lone man on the new roof across the yard, now he too has entered the poem's room. Try not to make that mistake.
Thank you.
Yes.
So this is an interesting poem, this being the title poem of the collection, also coming as it does sort of second to last.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there are several poems throughout the collection that are poems about poems or poems about poetry in one way or another. And in particular, I feel like there is this question that kind of repeats through the collection of like what a poem is and what a poem does, what it can do, both for the writer and the reader. And I was sort of wondering if we could start there. For one, just, I don't know if that reading of your work resonates with you, but also just sort of what your thoughts are about that idea.
Well, I think I like what you're seeing. It's not something I've considered before. I'm pretty blind in terms of being able to see clearly my own work in any sort of anything larger than a poem by poem way. I do know that there are endless repetitions in the book, and my own struggle with the making of poems, I'm sure, comes out in almost every poem in the book. I mean, the forcing of myself to sit down and finally do the thing that I, to this day, have some deep avoidance reaction towards, I'm sure is part of what is coming off of the work, which would highlight the question of what a poem can do and can't do. Does that respond or even address your question?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things I'm thinking about is there was a review in The Stranger by Rich Smith. And one of the things that he said in there was that she uses poetry as a way to think, not merely as an artful record of thought, which I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about these poems. You know, when I think about what a poem does, oftentimes I'm thinking about that as a reader because I, you know, am mostly encountering other people's poems. But, you know, when I write my own work as well, I guess there's also the question of what the poem is doing for me as the writer. And this idea of using a poem as a way to think rather than just being a recording of a thought that you had, I thought that was an interesting one. And I wanted to sort of, you know, I thought that was an interesting thing in the review. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about it.
I mean, that rings true for me. I very rarely sit down and make a poem in such a way that I have really any idea what's going to happen. There's really the sense of feeling my way, again, blindly. For a long time, I did that according to sound. I'd sort of make my way from phrase to phrase according to the sounds I was making. And I had, for a long time, very little concern for meaning. I had a great faith that meaning would occur regardless of my intention. And that is how this book started, in that mode. The making of this book, I mean, it's a little book, but it was 10 years or more in the making. And throughout the course of the work in it, my style definitely changed. And nowadays, I enter into the mode of making a poem, it seems, although it's unfolding as we speak. I seem to have moved more into complete thoughts, maybe not beforehand, but at least during. And so the surprise of what comes out is a little, it's shifting. I mean, it's kind of bad for a podcast, but I have a very hard time being able to articulate myself about it.
Yeah.
But I have for a long time not been able to know what I think or really even feel unless I sit down and try to write about it.
Yeah.
And in a poem that takes that and just heightens it. because even while I'm doing that, I'm not seeing much further than the next word in front of me.
I mean, I think that that's something about the process of making art that I think a lot of artists are like that, right? Because there's something about the process of making the work that, requires you to sort of slow down and look at it a little more, especially like one of the things that you had said I think this was in an older interview, maybe from a few years ago, that you think of poetry as being something that's sort of labored over. And I did know that this book was a long time in the making. And so, if the process of making an individual poem is something that requires perhaps a long time, this is how I often work as well, whether I'm writing or primarily I'm a photographer. But often when I'm writing, I've published a couple of poems and it'll typically take me like a year, 2 years, 3 years to figure out a fairly short poem.
Yeah.
Or with my photography, a lot of times the individual images come very quickly. But, I won't necessarily realize what the work is about or what the feeling that is motivating me to take the pictures is until I've already been shooting for a year or so. You know what I mean? I think that approach it's not uncommon.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best work comes out of letting that time be a part of the composition process, almost like another ingredient.
I do feel like time is an interesting component of this collection. But, I think before I move on to that, the thing that you were saying before about how your approach changed, and you'd actually mentioned this in some of our emails that we had before this conversation, that your approach changed. And reading through the second time, it was a little easier to notice that, just because I think, when you first approach a book, it's not obvious, because they're not usually presented in chronological order, right?
The poems. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not always obvious, like I wrote these in this particular order or whatever. But thinking about that was interesting. And I was just kind of wondering if what do you think is motivating that change in approach, or at least is there a difference in feeling or a difference in, I find that, when my work changes, it's not just the work that's changing, right? It's like something else in me that's also changing. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that what is causing the changes in the way that I make poems and the poems themselves that I'm making are due in large part to a change in my person. I wouldn't know how to necessarily accurately define that change, but I do know that I went through a piece of time where I wasn't writing, or I was trying to write and nothing was coming. And it coincided with my marriage, which I got married almost 7 years ago. And that is a happy thing in my life, but it definitely fucked with my concept of myself and my subject matter as a poet, and even really my drive. And almost simultaneous with the marriage, there was a failure of a couple of very important friendships in my life. So there was a loss there that took several years to sort of metabolize. And throughout that time, I was trying to write and it wasn't working for me. And I sort of withdrew. And I feel like in those years, something changed. And I wasn't aware of those changes until the book got taken and I had to sit down and go back and look at it. It became clear to me that a lot of the poems that were in that version of the book were of a different time, of a different order. If that makes any sense.
Oh, it definitely does. I think that word that you used, that it took time to sort of metabolize these experiences, is something I think about so much. I've mentioned this probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 times in various conversations I've had. But one of the conversations I had a few years ago with another poet whose name is Jose Olivares, we were talking about how, for him, he was talking about how he oftentimes needs a little distance from an experience or an event before he can really write about it in a way that makes sense. I find for myself that oftentimes there's a little bit of a tension in there, because if I don't take time to metabolize the experience, then the work that I make tends to be very inscrutably personal, or just sort of too raw to be of any use to anybody, even myself.
Yeah.
But if I wait, then sometimes the urgency isn't
Mm-hmm.
there to write
Mm-hmm.
about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of tough to balance those two things. You know what I mean?
I totally do. I think for me too, it's a lot about ego, which as a younger poet, I was full of and still am. But with each sort of poetic attempt, I was so eager to find out after each attempt whether I was any good. Am I any good? Do you like me? You know, I'm going to send it. And it was this rush to get work out into the world so that I could have hopefully the positive response. And there was the experience of looking at a poem one day and thinking I was the best thing that ever happened to poetry. And then there is the looking at it the next day and seeing clearly that I completely sucked. And I rode that seesaw for a long time. And it wasn't until I sat down to edit the work of The Slip, which is only my second book. And, I'm 50 years old, but, late bloomer. But I found that after several years had passed, these poems hang on a clothesline in a very long hallway in my apartment and have been hanging there and hang there still. Those poems have been hanging there, and I almost cringed when I would remember to notice them, because what if I looked and the work was horrible, So when the book was taken and I had to sit down and finally edit, I cringed. But when I sat down, I saw, and it was such an amazing experience to sit down and be able to see the work clearly. And if something wasn't working, it just simply wasn't working. It had nothing to do with my worth as a human or as a poet, or enough time had passed that the ego was completely gone. And I was able to see if the poem worked or if it didn't, or if parts of it worked and what I might need to change to make it work. And it had no reflection on me. And that was a pretty intense and very freeing experience for me.
I find that looking back on my older, it's actually really only this way with writing. Like for some reason, it doesn't seem to be the case with my visual art.
Uh-huh.
But with writing, that if I look at something that I wrote like 2 years ago, it's excruciating.
Uh-huh.
But if I look at something I wrote maybe like 15 years ago, even if I think that it's terrible, I have this ability to be a little gentler in my assessment of both it and of myself at the time.
Yeah.
Do you find that's the case?
Yeah. I mean, I just think that the ego has moved on, after a certain amount of time has passed.
I do feel like there's a strain of this sort of running through this collection, actually, because I feel like a lot of the poems in this collection are sort of reflecting over the speaker's younger days, perhaps, and reflecting over how things are different now than the time that's being contemplated in the poem. And I find that, I mean, maybe it's just sort of the age that I am, that I'm 41 now. And, in talking to a lot of my contemporaries, I feel like we all kind of go through this thing when we're maybe starting in our late 30s, or maybe, depending on the person, maybe starting in our 40s or even 50s. But we all go through a thing where we reach a certain age and we start reflecting a lot more. What I mean?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like there's a fair amount of that in this collection. And it's really interesting to me how I feel like there is often this real strong impulse to want things to mean something, to want things to make sense when you consider the arc of your life. And I feel like there are these two sort of twin impulses in many of these poems of like, there is that impulse, but there's also the opposite, And I found that a really interesting sort of tension,
I mean, I love when things almost make sense. I love coming up against a near understanding or an understanding that might fall apart if you attempt to put it into words. And I feel like that was and is still, I think, my project with poetry in general is to get up against what you know but can't say. And I'm trying to do that in an art form that uses words and speech as its pretty much only mode, speech and silence. But it's the immensity of any understanding that I don't even know how to say this correctly, but is that coming across? You understand what I'm trying to say?
I think I do.
Uh-huh.
And I think this actually sort of bears on the form of many of these poems as well, where a lot of the poems, they leave things unsaid, where like in some cases, it almost seems as though there is a word there that's been intentionally left out, where in other cases, it just sort of seems like that there is a narrative behind the poem, but it's not being referenced. And in particular, you were having a conversation, your interview with Jeff Alessandrelli for the Kenyon Review. You were talking about M dashes, which I thought was really interesting. And there was a thing that you said about the M dash being able to, I'm going to get the exact quote here, that it's like a little suspension bridge. It can mark a moment of semi-supported free fall between the last thing and the next. And sometimes when there isn't any next, it directs the reader into the midst of mystery, the silence of an unresolved ending. You know, one of the things I was thinking about in this book is the way that whether it's an unresolved ending or an unreferenced but present narrative or a missing word or even, perhaps breaking a line on a preposition or in the middle of a word, or there is this way I feel like this is sort of getting back to the idea of what a poem does, or at the very least, how it does it. And I never like the idea of just talking about a poem or any art form in terms of, is this accessible or not? Because I feel like that's a little too reductive. But what I do often think about is the experience of the art. And if the experience of it is maybe a little confusing at first, what does that sort of do to the experience? I feel like there is a way that perhaps it can be a turnoff, I guess, but I think that for an engaged reader, it can be the kind of thing that makes you pay closer attention, and the reader does a little more of the work.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. And there's a thing about the word of an unresolved ending. It made me think of an unresolved chord and how there's, science people doing MRIs on people's brains when they listen to music. And when the last note of the chord isn't there, the brain really tries hard to fill it in. That was something that I was thinking about a lot, especially in the second reading of these poems. Is that something that sort of resonates with you?
I mean, all of that, the multitude of what you just said, all of that resonates with me. I think poetry in general does that. I think that's what turns people off about poetry. And that, I mean, really, as a poet, one's audience is other poets in general. And God bless the people that read poetry that aren't also trying to be a poet too. There's that. But, so just the act of sitting down with a poem requires something of the reader in terms of attention that I think that I know isn't the same with other types of reading. Then to get into poetry that is more elliptical, potentially missing information, that type of thing, that does ask the reader for even more. But the payoff is what's so great about poetry, right? Once the reader does engage, if the reader does engage, and God bless the readers that do engage, they become part author of the poem as well. And the poem becomes a little machine, right? It becomes a living thing. The author sends it out into the world. The reader catches it and makes it have its meaning. And the poem becomes almost a living thing. That's been my experience as a reader, mainly. As a writer, it's more rare to get that kind of feedback from readers.
I guess one thing I'm kind of curious about is whether that is something that you are sort of aiming
Definitely.
for to create that kind of experience for the reader.
With students, I am always saying, trying to figure out what a poem means, I think does the poem and the experience of the reader a disservice. Letting the poem mean, letting the poem lapse in meaning, letting the poem do its work, and trusting one's experience as a reader when you don't understand something. I'm reading a poem and I don't get it. To try to figure out what a poem means is almost to try to paraphrase a poem, which is the death of a poem. I mean, the point of a poem is that the utterance can only be articulated in just that way. I mean, that's my understanding of at least the urge towards making a poem. It's the language of last resort, as Alan Grossman calls it. One is moved to make the poem and use these words in exactly this way. And sometimes that doesn't make sense. A lot of times it doesn't make sense, certainly not initially, to the reader. And any attempt to try to figure out meaning in any other words is to sort of chip away at a sculpture. And so the reading of poems is often filled with these uncertainties. And I think that is not to be something to be avoided or to be seen as a failure for the reader or for the poem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It reminds me of something that I heard Kava Akbar talking about, something similar on another podcast a few years ago, where he was talking about getting at the meaning of poems and how often people want to try to figure a poem out.
Yes.
And he was likening it to the experience more of like listening to a conversation through a wall, where you may not necessarily understand the actual words that are being said through the wall, but you can get a lot about the tone of voice and the sort of energy of it. And actually, I think that I kind of stole that. The person who introduced me to your work was Gabrielle Bates. And I sort of emailed back and forth with her a little bit to sort of try to get my arms around the book a little bit before we talked. And I think I had sort of stolen that phrase. I think I sort of changed it a little bit. I said to her that my first reading of The Slip kind of felt like I was listening to music through a door, and I wanted to find a key. I wanted to find a way to open the door so that I could hear it better. And I think that sort of gets at something, when you're talking about meaning in poetry, I love the phrase that you used, that's like paraphrasing the poem. And I do feel like a lot of times when, especially with sort of contemporary close reading practices, we're sort of trained in, at least in high school, or maybe if we took lit classes in college, we're trained to look at, this is what this image means. And this image is referencing this other artist's work. And that's what this means. And I think to me, that's sort of a less interesting way of engaging with the poem. Rather, what I'm always interested in is not so much necessarily what does the poet mean with this, but rather like, I'm having an experience with this. And why am I having that experience? I'm having a feeling. And how did the poet make me have that feeling? You know what I mean?
Right.
There is like a reaching towards wanting to understand something, I find that kind of confounding sometimes. Yeah.
But a lot of it, and I love yours or Kave's or Gabby's, I'm not sure who it ended up being, the image of hearing a conversation through a wall. I really like that as applied to The Slip. I feel like a lot of living for me is trying to figure out what the hell am I supposed to do next? and the answers are coming in a very, very muffled, hard to make out, but still, the sense of something or some part of myself or something external to me is trying to communicate what to do next. And I think that mode of trying really hard to listen and getting a sense, but not being able to figure out exactly what exactly to do next is behind my basic urge to sit down and make a poem.
Yeah, I love that. I think we need to take a little break here and come back and do the second segment. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, what I thought I wanted to talk about is probably still what I want to talk about, but we have already talked about it, which is time, just the concept of time and also the effects of time, but maybe even more specifically, duration.
Mm-hmm.
And as it pertains to lived experience, that is age. I tried to find there's a pithy quote somewhere about how age, it's like a brand new thing. It's like, in my 20s and 30s, and even really midway through my 40s, everything seemed new, and also nothing seemed new. There was no real, there's always the fear of aging and under that, the fear of, I suppose, dying. But in those years, particularly the 30s and early 40s, it's almost like I had arrived at a place. I got to know the place, and then I did my life there. I made my life. I made my mistakes. I tried all the different things there. And then around the middle of my 40s, continuously through where I'm at now at age 50, it's like everything's new. The way my body is, the effect of just having been around on this planet for this amount of time. Sarah Manguzo, I forget where she wrote, it's in a poem of hers where she talks about, it's sort of like time has this effect of, if you take a sculpture and rolled it down the hill and all of the unnecessary or extra or externalized parts kind of break off. And what you get at the bottom of the hill is what's left of the sculpture. And that is a new shape, and it's a different thing. So I suppose, it's just a ride. Being a person is just a ride, and waking up and being surprised that I've learned how to be the least bit patient with myself or others or with a poem or a project is such a bizarre thing. Have you ever had any experience like that? It's almost like, for me, my age, and I'm not like elderly, but I have entered into a different category, like all of a sudden, I need to get X, Y, and Z, health tests done. And anyway, I just, it seems like a youth almost because things are new.
Yeah. No, I think I do know what you mean. The thing that's actually immediately popping into my head is this Neutral Milk Hotel song, In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. And he's got this line where he says how strange it is to be anything at all.
Yeah.
I think about that all the damn time because life is really weird. Speaking of quotes that we can't quite locate, there is this, I swear, I don't know where I heard it before. And I've been looking for it for probably 5 years now. I have a few like that. Yeah, I can't find it. Where somebody somewhere, I read or heard or saw somebody say something to the effect of, the thing about life is that we're all going through it for the first time. Yeah. And I think about that. I wish I could find the source. I've been looking for so long. But I think about that a lot too. And, for me, a lot of times it became a little sharper when I had kids. I have 3 kids. The oldest is 12 and the youngest is 6. And so I see them going through things for the first time. But and that's a really sort of obvious thing because they're young. But what that does for me is not so much, it does. I do think about their experience, but it actually makes me think about how my experience of them experiencing things is me experiencing it for the first time. I feel like it's like that with everything, where I never quite feel like I have something to stand on, It's such a weird thing. And I think I may have been, I don't know if precocious is quite the right word, because I think I started thinking about stuff like this when I was in my middle 20s. But there is a thing about time for me that, like, in the best of moments, it's merely bizarre. And in the worst of moments, it's terrifying, I feel like a lot of the reason why I end up doing anything as an artist is in some way to do with that strangeness. You know what I mean? Like one of the series that I have probably talked about too much on the show, but I haven't talked about it with you yet. So, is that maybe 6 or 8 years ago, oh gosh, it was 10 years ago at this point, I went back to my hometown for the first time in 7 years because my parents had moved away. This was in 2011, and they had moved away a while before that. And I hadn't been there in a long time. And I went and wandered around my neighborhood and the rest of my town, a small little town in Northern California. And I was just sort of overwhelmed by this rush of feelings. And I ended up taking pictures that day. And then I came back several times over the course of the next, say, 3 years or so, and took more pictures every single time. And eventually what came out of that was a series of photographs that was all about the feeling of not being able to go home again. And I think about that a lot because in the process of making that work, the sort of acute feeling of loss and longing that I had that first day, it's not there anymore. And I think the process of making the work helped me sort of metabolize that experience. But there is still this sort of ache to it where I feel like I think I live in the past maybe more than most people do. And getting my arms around the distance between now and then can be challenging for me. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were talking about, but I feel like it's at least tangentially
it totally
related.
Is. And the conversation is endless because, you just spoke of the difference between now and then, and yet now is always then, right? It's never now. Yeah. It's always, it's always passing.
Yeah.
I feel like also you were talking about the experience of going back and taking those photos the first time and how there was an intense feeling on that first visit. And that over time, the intensity of that feeling has lessened, although you still feel that ache. And I always, my reaction, even just listening to you say that, is that's the loss for me. When that intense feeling fades, that's what's heartbreaking to me. And this is also very tangential, but I used to be someone who had lots of relationship drama, lots of in and out of relationship, one person after the next, and lots of overlap. And I remember the ending of one particular relationship and really being able to articulate to myself at that time that, I was in pain over losing this person. And then I was afraid to lose the pain of losing that person, because that would mean that time had passed and that person was gone. And for me, a lot of it, just to circle back to what we were talking about in the first half, was, that loss of longing when I got married was a real subject matter killer for me to enter into a solid, good, non-drama relationship, gave me so much, but also, seriously hacked away at what had been my subject up until then, which was that intense longing. And a lot of that longing is in that kind of nostalgia.
I feel like, and I think this is sort of what you were talking about when we started this segment, that there is a way in which or I don't know if I should say we, but at least I can look back at the intense feelings that I had when I was younger and feel like, well, I'm done with that now. But in reality, that's not really true. Like I still end up having, pretty intense experiences from time to time. And, maybe they're not even less frequent than I used to. It's just that I'm remembering all of those past ones all on top of each other. So they feel like they were constantly happening. Where in reality, probably when I was in my 20s, I was bored just as much as I am now.
Yeah.
But I think that there is, I'm going to be extremely obnoxious here for a second because I think the worst thing that a person can do in a regular conversation is to quote Nietzsche, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Okay.
I'm at least going to paraphrase him. He has this line in Beyond Good and Evil, this section that, for the most part, when I was reading this as an undergraduate, my main takeaway was that Friedrich Nietzsche is an asshole. But this one passage stuck out to me, and I always keep coming back to it, that he talks about this thing where when you're young, you're really intense. And then 10 years later, you look back in that and you're like, oh, gosh, look at how young I was. And then 10 years after that, you realize that, oh, that was being young too. I think about that all the time. There's probably 10 years from now, I'm going to look back at this time in my life and think of it in the same way.
Exactly.
That now I'm thinking about 10 years ago, right?
And me with my worry over being age 50, it's going to seem like I'm a kiddo, in 10 years. It's funny you bring up the Nietzsche, the Beyond Good and Evil. I've never read it, but I'm in a Zoom book club right now that's reading. We're about halfway through Moby Dick. It's the first time I've ever read it. And someone in the class was talking about that book and saying that it's one of those titles that pretty much sums up the whole thing. It's the title that's so great, Beyond Good and Evil. Just the idea of that, Beyond Good and Evil. And you pretty much don't have to read the book. And the title's the best thing about it. So it's just funny to me. That was just last night that you brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah. I do feel like, and I don't know if this is, I want to say that this is not just because I'm getting towards the middle part of my life, or, who knows, maybe I'm already past the middle part of my life. No way to know, right? But I'm very interested in work lately that is, or not even just art. I'm just interested in this experience of an accumulation of time, especially, thinking about the concept of duration and the strangeness of time. I feel like this past year is a really perfect example of this, because it's been like almost 10 months now, and it feels simultaneously like 10 years and also 10 days.
It's perfect. And you're so right to point that out. I myself, for my whole life, worked in restaurants and supplemented that with teaching here and there. But I worked in restaurants to make my money. And on March 11th, the chef that I worked for closed all of his restaurants. I had worked for him for 16 years, and I have been just sort of swimming in uncertainty ever since then. Thank God that my husband has remained working, and also that we don't have kids. I'm not dealing with what you're dealing with, the at-home schooling and that kind of thing. But the sense of time, the whole, it's flown by, and it's also, it seems like years, just like you said. And two, I think that because time, and they say, and I'm never really able to get my brain around the concept of time, but just like you said, sometimes it goes fast and sometimes it goes slow. And right now it seems to be doing both at the same time. But I had the thought recently that it's all true. You're waiting for the clock, you're waiting for the pot to boil, and time slows down. And we think, oh, it's not really slowed down. It's just because we feel that way. But we're the ones who invented time. And maybe it really does slow down. And when it flies, like maybe it really is going faster. That's a thought that I had recently that I felt, so I guess, some sort of personal sense of agency with regards to it. Yeah.
I think that the perception of time is such a weird thing. One of the things that freaks me out the most in my life is reading about brain science, because that's when I feel like the most disconnected from reality is learning about how the brain processes things like this, and how, and I'm gonna oh gosh, I'm going to be obnoxious again. There's now it's not going to be Nietzsche. It's going to be Nabokov. I remember this was probably 15 years ago. I read his book,
Yep.
Ada or Ardor. And the way that book is structured such that the first section of the book is this long sprawling thing that takes the course of one young summer, 300 pages of one summer. And then by the fourth section of the book, it's 50 pages of 20 years. I haven't ever gone back to read that book, but I think about it all the time about how things felt like forever when you were a kid. And then everything feels really compressed when you get to be an adult. Brain scientists will talk about this in terms of it didn't actually feel different when you were living through it. It's just that the way that you remember it is different now. But I think, whatever the clocks are doing, that you're onto something here with this idea that, the way that you experience it, it does mean something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no more than just complete agreement. I'm not sure what the thing that it means is, but it's got to count, right?
I feel like for the artist too, it's if, I guess not every artist is like this, but it seems like I am like this, and it seems like perhaps you might be like this too, that the art is, at least in some way, driven by the experience of being alive and what that experience is like. So I think maybe you can't help but get wrapped up in stuff like that. Okay. Well, all right. So there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experieed recently.
There is, and I was prepared for that question, and I'm excited for that question. And it's I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it should be up your alley since you're a photographer. It's a diptych. It's a set of 2 pictures, black and white, by Robert Capa, and it's of the Tour de France. And the 2 pictures are sort of a unit. And what they depict is the crowd lined up along the sidewalk in Brittany, waiting for the bicyclists to pass. And in picture number 1, all of the people are looking towards the oncoming bicyclists. Their faces are lit up with the experience of anticipating the bicyclists coming. And then picture number 2 is the same bystanders, the same people looking at the bicyclists after they've gone by. And so they've all turned in the other direction. Some of them are kids, and their bodies have assumed the shape of the bicyclers. And you can see a little wind going through some people's hair. And it's just astounding to me. First of all, it's the title of the set of pictures is the Tour de France. And yet in it, you don't see the race at all. You see the people watching the race. And also speaking of time, something has happened. Time has passed between the 2 pictures. And in that time was this, long stream of athletes going by on their bicycles. It's just, I can look at it endlessly. Are you familiar with these 2 pictures?
Not these ones specifically. I mean, I know Kappa's work, but not these ones in particular. I'll have to look this up. I'll find it. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Really, without photographing the thing itself, photographing what's surrounding the thing itself, it manages to give a sense of the movement of it, I think, maybe even better than seeing the thing itself. Yeah. And in that slot is a certain duration of time.
Photography is one of those mediums that is sort of obsessed with time.
Right.
I mean, it's built right into the mechanics of it. Everybody's always talking about, 1 125th of a second, 1 250th of a second. Right
now.
It's interesting. I've often felt that photography is in many ways sort of the most conservative visual art because of the way that it's tied to time. But I think that I find that both in my own work and in work that I admire, a lot of it I find more interesting when it is not a picture of the thing, but it's a picture of something that suggests the thing. And I think for exactly the reason that we were talking about when we were talking about your poems, that it engages the viewer and requires the viewer to do something. In my own work, I'm often trying to take photographs of things that are intangible, like I'll have photographs of my children, for example, but the thing that I'm actually trying to capture is not my children, but rather the way I feel about my children and the way I feel about myself as their parent. And you can't take a picture of an emotion. And I think it's exactly the thing that you're talking about with these photographs. And so I really love images that are not of the thing, but are still of the thing,
And it goes back in another way to poetry itself. In the case of these photographs, it lets the viewer enter into and complete the experience. It's an interactive experience that requires a viewer to look at these viewers of this race to make the race happen, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you. I'm going to look up that photograph, but thank you for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thank you for talking with me.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to purchase copies of The Slip. I also highly recommend ordering it from your local independent bookstore. And don't forget to listen to Kary's bonus reading via the KTCO Patreon page at patreon.com/likewisemedia. The complete bonus archive is currently open to the public, so do check that out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, it would really make my day if you shouted out the episode on social media and tagged the show in your post. It's at ChannelOpenPod on Twitter and Instagram. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. Next time, I'll be talking with poet Gabrielle Bates for the KTCO Book Club about Bridget Pegeen Kelly's 1994 poetry collection, Song. That will be coming on March 10th, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.